Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be speaking today on the historical rise of geometric patterns in Islamic cultures, and the maturing of this art form, especially during the Seljuks Sultanate of Rum. And let's see. So this is a whole area of specialization in and of itself, and one could spend time talking just about the antecedents to Islamic geometric art. But I'm just going to show a very few samples here. These are some Roman mosaics. And on the left is a fourfold pattern, and on the right is a 3- and 6-fold pattern, an isometric pattern and an orthogonal pattern. And you can see clearly similarities to later Islamic work. And then one of the cultures that was influential on early Muslim artists and design were the Christians in Egypt, the Coptic traditions in Egypt. They had their own traditions of interweaving pattern. This is a lovely piece of textile. I haven't said, but I believe it's around 5th century. And in a couple slides from now, you'll see something similar that's from the Umayyad period, but in paving. But if you pay attention to the 8-pointed star in the center, moving into the curvilinear design on the outside. Here is a Sassanid window grill. It's made from gypsum plaster. And in and of itself, it's not very interesting, geometrically speaking. But it's interesting because soon after this was made, during the Umayyad period in the 1st century of Islam, some rather remarkable window grills were produced with quite beautiful geometric patterns. And this tradition of making geometric window grills that arose during the Umayyad period may have had antecedents from earlier Sassanid work, as simple as this may be. Certainly, the Persians were another source of design influence to the early Muslims. So here's a ceiling from Baalbek in Lebanon, quite lovely geometric pattern, quite simple. Again, it's isometric in its repeat. Here's this. So now we're looking at some early Islamic work. This is a piece of paving. It's Umayyad, and it has similarities to that Coptic piece of textile that I showed a moment ago. It's quite lovely. But it still is very, very reminiscent of the tradition of Hellenic paving, tesserae paving. Now we're looking at the window grills, 2 window grills in Damascus. The one on the left is orthogonal, and the one on the right is isometric. The reason I'm emphasizing isometric and orthogonal is because again and again, in these early examples, it's one or the other. The development of patterns with 5-fold symmetry, 7-fold symmetry had not happened yet, and the artists were working with patterns that were primarily either orthogonal or isometric. These are some more Umayyad window grills. These were excavated. They're quite beautiful. They're both, again, isometric on the left, orthogonal on the right. So here's a very nice piece of wood carving, and it's quite early. It's Umayyad. It's from Jerusalem. And here's an example, an Umayyad example from Yemen. And interestingly, on the left-hand side, again, orthogonal, and on the right side, isometric. Now, I'm jumping into the Abbasid period, and strictly speaking, the piece on the left repeats on a rectilinear grid. The hexagons center to center on the horizontal is shorter than center to center on the vertical. But it's, I think, good to show this because it represents an interest in those days of working with geometric grids as ornament. And grids become even more important later on in the tradition because they become the underlying structure upon which more complex patterns are created from. But the use of grids themselves as ornament is apparent from the very early days. Oops. And so the Abbasids expanded rapidly, and they moved their capital to Baghdad. They built Baghdad, I should say, as their capital. And from there, their sphere of influence was very wide. An example of Abbasid work in the western regions of their empire comes from the Great Mosque of Karawan, where the wooden mimbar, which is one of the earliest mimbars to survive the earliest periods, still stands, and it's a virtual cornucopia of pattern. It's many, many separate individual patterns, none of which are particularly complex, most of which are either simple geometric patterns or rather simple floral patterns that repeat on a geometric grid. And again, those grids are isometric or orthogonal. The adjacent mirhab to the mimbar also the tiles were made in Baghdad like the mimbar was and exported to North Africa at the time. And they also, I don't have a photo, but they also have a nice representation of simple patterns that were being produced at that time. And this also comes from Karawan, at the Great Mosque of Karawan in Tunisia, as with the mimbar. And this is a Aghlabid bookbinding cover, and you can see the orthogonal pattern. This pattern is an interesting pattern because it's still used today by people who do cane work for furniture. For cane furniture, this pattern is the predominant pattern for cane workers to this day. It's an ancient pattern. Then the Abbasid Empire sent a commander to Egypt to quell an unrest. He formed his own empire, but it was really part of the greater Abbasid influence and domination of the period. And so these are from the Ibn Tulun Mosque in Cairo. Ibn Tulun was from Bokhara, originally Turkic, and ended up founding an empire in Egypt. And these are the soffits of arches. And each of these is an isometric design, quite beautiful. And these are also three examples of orthogonal work from the Ibn Tulun. The one on the upper right is a star and cross pattern, a rather rudimentary version of it. It sort of indicates that the knowledge of the patterns was still imprecise, but it's nonetheless a well-known pattern, early example of one. And on the left is again this same, around from the same period, another example of the star and cross pattern that comes from Balkh in Afghanistan. This particular mosque, the Nogambad, was built quite early on, as you can see, and 9th century. And it's got some superb work that's in really very good condition, considering its age. The building itself is not, but some of the ornaments are. And you can see on the right the use of a polygonal grid. On the left is the pattern, well-known pattern. And now, at around 1000, in Baghdad, this piece of illumination was produced by Ibn al-Bawab, and it's really now representing, you could say, sort of the most sophisticated patterns of that period of time. This is another level of greater complexity to previous work. So thus far, we've really been looking at the work of the Middle East, North Africa, and the eastern provinces, but at the same time that work was going on, in the far west of the Islamic world, where the Umayyad dynasty had maintained itself by fleeing the Middle East and settling in Spain, these pieces were made. It's during the same period of Abbasid dominance, but done independently of the Abbasids. But that said, stylistically, it's to a very high standard of quality and beauty and sophistication. And again, you notice on the left is the isometric, and on the right is the orthogonal. Then jumping back to the east again, I now want to look at the work by some of the dynasties that were heavily influenced by the Abbasids, but were semi-autonomous or completely autonomous to them. This is a Sassanid arch at the Arab Ata, and you can see it's late 10th century. And the ornament is really very similar to that piece on the left right here, in the sense that it's a very well-constructed, well-conceived isometric design. This is a different design, but it's built within 15 years of the piece in Spain. So now we're looking at a range of space from Uzbekistan in the east to Spain in the west, where a style, a geometric aesthetic has developed that is very similar in a broad swath of the Earth's globe. So during that same Sassanid period, by the way, the Sassanids were a Sunni dynasty that became extremely powerful, semi-autonomous from their Abbasids, the Abbasids in Baghdad, but they recognized the authority of the Caliph, and their work. I'm going to just diverge for a second and mention that there's a little bit of debate within the world of art history over where these patterns, where the sophisticated origin of the patterns developed. And one school of thought is that they developed sophistication in and around Baghdad, and that there was a active movement on the part of Baghdadi craftsmen working with mathematicians and under royal patronage to influence the arts in a positive way, and that this had a profound effect on complexity and variation of symmetry and design types, and that spread outward from Baghdad to the rest of the Islamic world. That's one sort of potted version of one school of thought. I am of a different school of thought, generally speaking. I think that Baghdad, not to say that it didn't have its importance, but I believe that the architectural record indicates that the greater sophistication happened in the eastern provinces, primarily under the patronage of Turkic dynasties in the east, and it was these more complex pieces of work and artistic tradition were reintroduced or introduced westward from Khorasan and Transoxiana, and I'll show examples in a moment. So here is a nice piece that's from around Nishapur, and this is a isometric design. This is from that same excavation outside Nishapur, and it's a nice orthogonal design. That's your classic star and cross pattern. This is a curvilinear version of the star and cross pattern that's built around the same period under Ubayd patronage. They were a Shia dynasty that ended up conquering the Abbasids and ruling Baghdad and subjugating the caliphate. they, being Shia, they were the source of interest to reconquer by later Seljuks. But they certainly, this is Bayeux as well, they certainly embraced the prevalent geometric aesthetic of the time. So now we're into the Ghaznavids' work. The Ghaznavids were a Turkic dynasty. They were completely autonomous from the Abbasids. They were Sunnis, so they recognized the caliph, but they did not pay tribute. And they started off as military commanders working for the Sassanids, and then they overthrew them, and they ruled a very large area of Khorasan, Transoxiana, way to the west, as far as Azerbaijan. They had a large area that they ruled, and they really are the ones that pioneered the brickwork aesthetic, the use of bricks to make complex patterns in calligraphy. They were masters of brickwork, although this is not brickwork. So, nor is this. This is a stone panel. It's a beautiful design. Now we're getting into a more sophisticated level of design than previously, although it's still isometric. On the left is the Ghaznavid piece. On the right is the same pattern from 100 years later from the Mimbar at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. It's so interesting that this exact same pattern is in the two places. It reinforces this idea that the knowledge of this kind of pattern making was transferred from the east westward. Now, this is a particularly interesting building. This is the Ghaznavid minaret of Masood III in Afghanistan, in Ghazni, Afghanistan. And this is one of the earliest examples, a building with amongst the earliest examples of patterns with 5-pointed and 10-pointed and 20-pointed stars. It's really quite early. It's late 11th century, early 12th century, and it's in very poor repair. And the photographs, I've tried to get good photographs. I have not been able. I've spoken to people in Afghanistan. I've done everything I can, and it's too dangerous to get to right now. The pattern on the left is this beautiful pattern made up with 10-pointed stars. This is a quick analysis of it. It repeats on a rhombic grid, the angles of which correlate with the decagon. So the rhombic grid is a very convenient way to make fivefold patterns. And the simple arrangement of decagons on the left, touching point to point, is made more complex by an infill, and then the infill is given a widened line treatment and an interweave. Very successful and very early example of a complex fivefold design. This is also from the same building, and this is the earliest example that I know of throughout all of Islamic cultures with a pattern of sevenfold geometry. And so here's a quick version of it. The repetitive grid is in the white lines. You can see it's an elongated hexagon, the angles of which, both the two angles that make up the hexagon, relate to the sides of the heptagon, seven-sided polygon. And it's a very beautiful design, and this is a real leap in complexity to the work that was being done previously. So now another one of the Eastern dynasties were the Karakanids. They were a confederation of Turkic peoples, and they ruled a very large area north of the Oxus River, and this example is from Kyrgyzstan, and there are 3 adjacent tombs that are made by the Karakanids, and they have a nice assortment of patterns. Again, they started off being allies of the Ghaznavids and ended up being rivals, but their art is of the same stylistic aesthetic as well as level of quality. They did marvelous work. These are both orthogonal patterns. These are both isometric patterns from one of the adjacent tombs to the last in the same complex, small complex. These are both quite beautiful designs. And this again, this is from Bokhara. It's also Karakalid. And these are orthogonal designs. And then another group in the Far East were the Ghurids. And let me just say that during this time, around, from the late 10th century up until the Mongols, it was a very heady time. It's 250 years or so of strife between rivaling dynasties. But despite that high level of political and military strife and conflict, there was quite a remarkable degree of aesthetic continuity between these cultures. So the Ghurids were a group of people that rose to power out of a remote central Afghan area near Jam. They're thought to be Tajik by origin, from eastern Iran, but nobody really knows for sure. They were certainly great warriors. They ended up conquering all of northern India. They ruled northern India for a long time. They lost control to the Seljuks in Khorasan, but they maintained control for a long time into the 13th century in India and Pakistan. So this is a lovely isometric piece. This is one of their pieces. This is from the Minaret of Jam on the left, and this is the Muslim at Chist, and you can see the quality of the work is really up there with the Ghaznavids, high quality brickwork. And this is also one of their pieces. You saw this in Eric's presentation a moment ago. This is another one of the outstanding pieces of Ghaznavid brickwork. And, Ghurid brickwork. And then one of my all-time favorites for not just the Ghurids, but for the whole eastern region, is this piece from the ceremonial arch in Bust in Afghanistan. And this is an outstanding and early example of the classic fivefold pattern that you see again and again throughout the Islamic world. It's so classic that you can call it iconic. And Eric was making reference to the relationship between designs, not just a single design itself, but the design in the context of the greater building. And related to that subject is the subject, and he also touched on this, the subject of the use of patterns that are used with great repetition so that they become highly recognizable from building to building as you would move around town or from town to town or even from country to country. And this is a case, and contrasting that with designs that are more idiosyncratic and unique to their circumstance. And this is a great example of a design that's iconic. This is actually rather iconic too, very well known throughout the Islamic world. And this is also, and this is now the first slide that's produced by the Seljuks. The Seljuks, again, were a Turkic group. They're, in the grand scheme of the sweep of history, immensely important. They conquered huge amounts of land, and the areas that they didn't hold themselves, they just by the threat of their nearby presence, they were able to demand tribute from nearby cultures that essentially became under their control, and throughout that large area of their control, they introduced, and in some cases reintroduced, this more complex form of geometric aesthetic and geometric pattern making. So the Seljuks really brought this tradition of pattern making forward. This is another example of a fivefold design that repeats on a rhombic grid. You can't see it very well. I knew that you wouldn't be able to, so I just drew up a quick semblance of the pattern. And another rather simple but very elegant fivefold pattern. Here's a Seljuk pattern from Dolatabad in Balkh, Afghanistan. This is a fourfold design that is extremely successful. The Seljuks were really the masters of architectural brickwork, and never to be superseded by any other culture. Even the best European brickwork doesn't really come close to the brickwork of the Seljuks. So now this is another fivefold pattern. This is a different family of pattern that I call 2-point. Still pretty early. And yet another one, this has got, and still, see, this is 1180. This is really still very early, but look at the sophisticated use of patterning. And this outer band is one of the earliest examples of a fivefold pattern that repeats on a on a rectilinear grid. And so now this is one that you'll see a lot of when Emil Makavaki gives his talk later on. This is the Gumbari Kabud in Maraga, and it's got this remarkable, it's a fivefold pattern, it's got remarkable characteristics that have similarities to, if not being identical to, Penrose tiling. I'm showing it less for that and more for the two qualities of design, two levels of design simultaneously happening, the primary and the secondary. And this is interesting to me because it points to a later development in Islamic architectural ornament where a primary and a secondary design level were employed. So this is kind of a harbinger for things to come. The Zangids were now moving westward. The Zangids were under the direct influence and domination of the Seljuks. They were in Syria and that region, and they were responsible for quite beautiful work, especially in wood. This is a piece of incised stone, kind of an ablak two-tone effect. They were amongst the early pioneers of this two-tone effect. A brass door with an orthogonal pattern with 12-pointed stars. This also Zangud. And then back in Baghdad during the Seljuk period, the Seljuks conquered Baghdad and brought to prominence once again the caliphate. The caliphate had still existed, but they'd been subjugated to such an extent, and the Seljuks moved westward to conquer Baghdad, to free Baghdad of the Bayuds. And so now there aren't too many existing pieces of architecture from this period. Most of what was done was destroyed by the Mongols, but those pieces that exist are outstandingly beautiful. And this is an Eldikzid building in Azerbaijan. They were a Western Atabeg of the Seljuks. They were Turkic, and they were working at an astoundingly high quality of design that you see on this building and just a very few other of their buildings. This particular example is 11 and 13 pointed stars. It rivals the most complex designs with two centers of symmetry that you'll find anywhere. So now we're in the 12th century and coming close to the end of the 12th century, and we're at a very high level of geometric complexity. These aren't so complex, but they're made by the Artikids. These are it's another Western Atabeg of the Seljuks, and these are rather nice, simple patterns. This one on the left is from the well-known Al-Jazari book on the knowledge of ingenious mechanical devices, and it's the instructions, it's an illustration with written instructions for a cast bronze doorway. So now all of this is really leading up to the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum here in Turkey. They had the great distinction of having their architecture survive the Mongol conquest. When the Mongols came so far west, rather than fighting the Seljuks, they negotiated with the Seljuks so that the Seljuks would pay a tax, and as a consequence, the Seljuks survived much longer than the Seljuks to the east, their cousins to the east in Iran. that were completely obliterated, and much of their architecture was also ruined. So the Seljuks, as I was saying earlier on the panel discussion, the Seljuks really took the knowledge that had been transferred to them, or that they had transferred themselves rather, to the West, to Turkey, and took it even farther. And I'm going to just flip through these quickly. They're really quite beautiful pieces. This one on the left is early 13th century. It's a five-fold design, but a rather complicated five-fold design. You can see it works on a rhombic grid. The one in the center is a five-fold design. It works on the rectilinear grid, and the one on the right works on a rhombic grid, but a thinner rhombus, 36 degrees instead of 72. And then this is a nice illustration of how different patterns of the different types can work together. And the top panel is a panel that has 6 and 9 pointed stars. It's non-systematic. I'll get into that later on. The center panel there's two varieties of five-fold pattern. Five-fold patterns like this are systematic, but again, I'll get into that later on. And the lower pattern is another systematic pattern, but it's made from a four-fold system. So you've got this diversity of patterns all happening together in a very balanced way. Now here's a pattern of 12s on a isometric grid, basically a triangular grid, 12 pointed stars on each vertice, and a very well-known common pattern, also non-systematic. Now we're into a pattern that has two regions of localized symmetry. The large central stars are 12-pointed stars, and the half stars on the edge are 8-pointed stars. So this is 8s and 12s, repeats orthogonally. This is a more complex pattern now, and it's 9, 10, and 12-pointed stars with octagons as well. So it's 8, 9, 10, and 12. So now I'm going to show some illustrations to talk about what makes up the mature tradition. And one feature of the mature tradition, and this is universal throughout the Islamic cultures, are patterns that have more acute angles. In this upper left corner is 45 degrees. To the right of it are median patterns. They have angles in between the more acute and more obtuse, in this case 90 degrees. And then on the lower left, obtuse patterns that have more obtuse angles, in this case 135 degrees. And then there's another family of pattern that's common throughout the Islamic world, where you have these crossing elements, but the way they relate to the underlying generative tessellation, in this case made up of octagons and squares, is through 2 points on each edge instead of one single point on each edge. So hence their name, 2-point. These four families are used throughout Muslim cultures. That was in the fourfold. This is in fivefold, and you can see the underlying structures, the middle points on the acute, in this case 36 degrees, on the median 72 degrees, the lower left obtuse with 144 degrees, and then the 2-point patterns have 2 points on the edge instead of a single point. Another feature of the mature tradition is just a wide variety of ways of realizing the line work. And this is just some quick drawings of different sort of conventions, you might say, gathering wideness, sometimes interweaving, sometimes not interweaving, sometimes a tiling treatment on the left. That's in the acute family. This is in the median, this is in the obtuse family. That's in the median family. And here's some widened lines in the 2-point family. Different Muslim cultures favor different approaches to modifying the strict pattern itself, like in the upper left-hand corner. Some favored interweaving, more than others. There are many cultural differences. It's an interesting study in itself. Another way of making designs more complex, or rather more varied, not really more complex, but giving them more variability, was how you treat the central star areas. So working up and down, on the left you can see the simple infill, again a simple closed center. On the obtuse and two-point, there was this convention of putting rosettes into the center of stars. A very simple way of making the rosettes is just to take the point of the larger star and to close it, and to add an element and extend it and rotate it. It's a simple enough thing. In the median family, you can also put a geometric rosette by subtracting out the central star that would otherwise be there, removing the interior of it, extending the lines, and treating it the same way. This is a variation that you see with some frequency, more in Egypt than here, but it's nonetheless done. Another way of giving variation to the central areas of symmetry, in this case with the 10-pointed star on the left, is to infill in that prescribed fashion, or the lower row is another way. Both of these were very commonly used from as early as the 12th century, especially the upper one. And then the two-point patterns can also be infilled with this kind of geometric rosette in two different ways. You can say B and C are two different ways of treating them. A is sort of the basic pattern that you frequently see. B and C are elaborations, and D is another way of that you sometimes come across, not too frequently, but sometimes. So now I want to talk a little bit about another aspect of the mature tradition, and that is different kinds of approaches to symmetry. And in this case, I'm just showing a standard isometric grid, orthogonal grid, and a regular hexagonal grid. And I've put in dotted, dashed red lines, the dual of the grid. And of course, as is well known, the dual of the isometric is the hexagonal and vice versa, and the orthogonal is self-dualing. Each of these, though, can be kind of used well, first of all, they can be used to make really quite complex patterns. So even though it's a very simple symmetry, it's just a square repeat. In this case, and this is from the Great Mosque of Busra, and I'm going to mispronounce, excuse me, but the Agzakara Han. There are several examples of this in Turkey, going back to the 13th century, and it's a quite complex pattern that puts 12-pointed stars at the vertices of the square repeat, and octagons at the center of the repeat, and at the midpoints of the square repeat are 10-pointed stars, and in the field on the inside, like right here, those are 9-pointed stars. So you've got 8, 9, 10, and 12 going on. Then another repetitive strategy is to use rhombi. I showed you the examples from the Ghaznavids that were fivefold. This is just showing, so on the left is the standard isometric grid, but with the horizontal lines taken out, making a rhombic grid with 120 and 60-degree angles. But if you distort that, if you stretch that, the rhombic grid will still tessellate nicely, and you can think of it as stretching, but for greater accuracy, if you determine the angles of each rhombus so that they relate to localized symmetry, in the center case it's tenfold. You see it's the more acute angle at the top are 2/10 or 72 degrees, and in the middle are 3/10 or 108 degrees. So by using the decagon, one can create a structure that allows you to use fivefold symmetry and tenfold symmetry in a repetitive fashion. Similarly, you can do the same exercise on the far right using 14s. So we have 3 14ths at the top and 4 14ths in the middle, and you get another rhombus that will repeat, allowing patterns with 7 and 14-pointed stars. So here we have a pattern from Turkey, that Seljuk pattern that is fivefold, and it's repeating on that rhombus. And then in another repetitive strategy is sort of an offshoot of the orthogonal grid on the left. If you stretch that grid, it becomes a rectangular grid, and you can stretch it, as it were, to correspond to different symmetries. In the center, again, we have 10. You can see how that rectangular proportion fits the decagonal layout at the top, and then on the right, it's fitting with a 14-fold. You can do the same thing with other symmetry groups. I've chosen 10, 14, just to show some variety. So here's a pattern that is, again, Seljuk Turkish. It's one of my favorite patterns. It's 12 pointed stars on a rectangular repeat and 10 pointed stars at the center. And of course, just like the square grid is self-dualing, the rectangular grids are self-dualing as well. And so then the hexagonal grid can also be modified to allow for different kinds of symmetries. The one on the left is the standard regular hexagon with 120 degrees, which constitutes 1/3 of a decagon on each corner. The one in the middle is 2/7 of a sevengon, a heptagon, or 3/7 in the middle. You can see how that's working, the proportions. And the one on the right, I've gone to 11s, showing 3 and 5/11 to determine the angles. And each of these can be used, and many, many, many others, to create all manner of geometric patterns that repeat in this rather eccentric way. So here are 3 historic patterns that were all from Seljuk Turkish patterns. The one in the upper left is an acute pattern. The one on the lower left is an obtuse pattern. These are both Turkish. The one on the right is a 2-point pattern. They all come from the same simple grid of heptagons laid out on that elongated hexagon. The upper right is the median pattern in the same family. I've never found it historically, but I've illustrated it. It's a perfectly nice pattern. And another repetitive strategy that's not so common, but they're delightful, is using these oscillating squares. And the difference between the one at the top on the left and the grid layout and the one underneath it is the angle of the rhombi. If you look at it, you can see the squares are different sizes, but they're squares. But the rhombi are either more acute, or in the upper left, they're actually double triangles. And so you can see the way a pattern is laid out quite simply. In either case, or in the lower case, it's laid out as a simple obtuse octagon inside the square, and it makes this beautiful pattern from the Sultan Han and Aksare. And then the upper one is from the Topkapi Scroll, and it's more complex. It's actually rather interesting. Either the rhombi themselves separated from the squares, they will make a very acceptable and well-known pattern by themselves. The squares will likewise make a pattern on their own, and also well-known, but in this case, the two are working together. It's kind of a hybrid pattern. Very, very nice pattern. Here's some more oscillating square patterns. This is the fundamental region. All of the information is contained in that one area, and it's rotated and then mirrored to achieve its repetition. The 7-pointed stars on the right, by the way, are non-regular. And then I've included this piece. This is also Seljuk, and it's perhaps the most complex of the oscillating square patterns that I've found. It's quite eccentric because the center points of each star lay upon the vertices of the grid, the oscillating square grid, but the lines of symmetry within the pattern don't conform to the lines of the grid, which is really unusual. So, just like that other example, going back just quickly here to upper right, shows hybrid use of rhombi and squares. The Seljuks also developed several patterns, probably all by the same person because they're all in the same building and they use some of the same forms from one to another. They're fivefold, and they're a hybrid of, in this example, 6 different shapes. And the 6 different shapes tessellate together in this way, this pastel way right here. And then if you apply the patterns to each of those 6 shapes, you can see that really the central triangle is just a half of the rhombus to the left of it. But the 5 shapes that aren't, excluding that half piece, those 5 shapes, the 3 on the right and the 2 on the left, will repeat as independent patterns. Each of them will repeat very effectively on its own. And in fact, the smaller rhombi on the left, or the rhombi on the left, is the classic acute pattern on its own. But when you combine them together in this way from the karate Han, it's really quite stunningly beautiful, and you end up with a rather complex design. Actually, it looks complex, but its constituent parts are not complex at all. And then I'm going to now talk about another key feature of the mature style, and that is methodology. And there are a number of different methodological approaches to making patterns. And I've listed them here: the compass work, graph paper work, point joining, extended parallel radii, and the polygonal technique. And so compass work kind of speaks for itself. It's using a grid and laying out the compass and repeating circles and interrupting the circles, creating patterns, usually made up of closed elements, but not exclusively. These are all historic examples. Those were isometric, these are orthogonal. These are early. The graph paper system is, as you'd expect, patterns that can easily be constructed from simple graph paper. In this case, it's isometric. The one on the left, the 2 on the left are following the lines themselves. The one on the right uses the vertices, but breaks with the lines of the graph itself to be out of sync with the graph, but still quite a nice pattern. It's a little more complicated. Each of these patterns can be made easily with a point joining technique or with a polygonal technique that comes up later. So here's a graph paper for an orthogonal design. This is a design that comes from Kyrgyzstan on a minaret. It goes around a minaret. This is an example of the problem, quote unquote, of graph paper designing, is that if you lay out your 8-pointed stars strictly following the graph paper, they're not even regular 8-pointed stars, and they have to be corrected, as shown on the right, to get the points to fall within a circle and to be of the same size. And so graph paper sometimes is a better way of conceptualizing a design, but not of creating a final piece. You can see here how the black represents the ideal design and how it doesn't quite work with the graph paper. And then this is an illustration by Jean-Marc Castera that I've taken the liberty to borrow that shows how the graph paper design technique can actually be used to create really quite complex patterns with 16-pointed stars in this case, and 8-pointed stars, using approximate coordinates of the grid. And this is a very effective way of laying out designs, and it's one that if you're interested in knowing more about, I would strongly recommend that you consult his book, or even better, he's here, you could consult him in person. But this illustrates the effectiveness of this technique for even more complex designs. Now, this is a technique that's hardly ever found, but there are some notable examples. This piece is my own design. I've chosen a simple pattern to illustrate the technique. On the far left is the regular hexagonal grid, but I've added radii so that each vertice has 9 radii. And then if I take those 9 radii and if I offset them in each direction, and I've offset them to be equal to 1/3 the distance of each edge of the red hexagonal grid, then those offset lines can be joined with each other and cut appropriately to end up with the pattern of 9-pointed stars on the right. This is not very commonly found in the traditional work. But one of the photographs that Eric showed earlier was this piece on the lower right. And these are three examples from Seljuk, Turkey. And the grid that they are based upon is orthogonal grid with 8-fold rotational symmetry and 12-fold rotational, 12 again, 10-fold, and then 16-fold. So you can see it's made up of 8, 10s, 12s, and 16s. And then by offsetting the lines, this is what I call a radii matrix on the upper left. By offsetting those lines, the artists were able to create these three designs that are really quite different from each other, but which are very similar. Well, no, I should say they're identical to their symmetrical structure. And it's interesting too that they all happened. They were all produced within 35 years of each other, and all within the same approximate part of Turkey. And one has to sort of assume that the same artist or the same atelier was involved in their creation. They're so unusual. And so now, moving on to point joining, Eric, who spoke before me, he is the absolute specialist in this field, and it's a technique that uses a progressively more complex series of lines being applied onto a geometric structure that you can then take some from and add some to, and you end up with a finished piece on the right-hand side that can then be used in repetition to create a finished pattern. From my experience, this technique is most effective for recreating existing designs than for creating brand new designs, especially if the new designs are rather complicated. It gets more and more unwieldy to use this step-by-step approach as the patterns become more and more complex with more variability between the areas of localized symmetry. This is one of the pages from the what's thought to be 12th century treatise called On Interlocking Similar and Congruent Figures. It's not known who wrote it. This will be spoken about after I finish in a minute in greater detail, but this talks about point joining as a technique. Clearly it was a technique that was used, and this is the primary source of our knowing that this was used. One of the last figures in this technique, in this book, is on the left here, and it's showing the step-by-step approach to making a design with 10 and 12 pointed stars. And the author of the manuscript it kind of broke down and wasn't able to finish it, and the instructions are unclear, and clearly he was grappling with the ability to give good, clear, concise instructions on how to make this rather complicated pattern, whereas in the Topkapi Scroll the same pattern is illustrated very clearly without such complexities or problems. And this is showing how the graph paper technique can be used to make this one pattern. The same pattern can easily be made with point joining, and the polygonal technique on the right can also be used to make the very same pattern. The advantage, in my opinion, of the polygonal technique is it's got the disadvantage of having to create an underlying structure first, but with that underlying structure, as you can see on the bottom row, you can get 4 different patterns. The acute, median, obtuse, and 2-point patterns will all be made from that, each of which is historic there. And then I'll just quickly, systematic patterns are made. This is also part of the mature tradition. I should try and wind up. The systematic patterns are, there are 5 systems. There's the regular polygons in the upper left. The upper right are the system of 4-8 system A and a 4-8 system B on the lower left. They're both create 4-fold patterns with 8-pointed stars. Then there's the 5-10 system. And then there's the rather obscure 7-14 system, which is very few examples outside of Mamluk Egypt of that system. One in Turkey, one in Samarkand. But other than that, they're all in Mamluk Egypt. So these systems have the benefit of taking pre-designed elements with the patterns and being able to reassemble those modules into any number of different patterns. So they're very convenient. A non-systematic pattern is like this one here. This is the grid for it. These connecting elements, the smaller polygons, if you take them as independent elements, they will not reassemble into any other configuration. They're fixed to this, they're specific to this tessellation and this tessellation alone. And this is a combination of 9, 10, 11, and 12 pointed stars. This one is Seljuk Turkish. That's the pattern itself. It's a beautiful pattern. And so then this is the pattern making. Again, we saw that basically. This is as it goes on to 10 pointed stars with 36 degrees, 72 with a median, the obtuse 108, and the 2 point. And now quickly the historical evidence for the polygonal technique. These are 3 examples, one from Cairo from the 14th century, from the Sultan Hassan, and the middle one is a Mughal screen from Fatehpur Sikri, and the third one is also a Mughal screen that's in a collection. It's not known where it originates from. It's part of that same tradition. The one on the right is the fourfold system. B rather, the one on the left is the 510 system. The one on the far left is non-systematic. This is another source of our knowledge that this was a technique that was used. On manuscripts, certain manuscripts, you can see the underneath the paint, the artist scribed in the structure from which the painting was laid down, or the pattern was laid down. And this one is at the British Museum. I had the opportunity to study it, and with the light at an oblique angle, it's possible to see the shadow of the underlying structure, thereby giving certainty to this structure having been used. One of the best sources for this technique, the polygonal technique, is the Topkapi Scroll. I had the great good fortune of being in Istanbul in 1986 when the Topkapi Scroll was on display. And I had already been working with underlying polygonal structures. I didn't know there was historical precedence for it, and I was delighted to come across a piece of proof that the techniques that I had been working with on my own behest were actually techniques that were used historically. You can barely see the underlying polygonal grid, but it is there. And then another source is the field reports from a gentleman named Hankin. This was published early on in 1925. He had been in India, and he had been in a domed room at Fatehpur Sikri where the dome was decorated with a geometric pattern, but the plasterwork had fallen off the ceiling in areas, and he could see through to the layout grid that the artist used to put the geometric pattern down, and it was a polygonal grid. He, based on what he saw, he wrote a fantastic paper, the drawing of geometric patterns in Saracenic art. It's well worth finding if you haven't seen it. And so this is another example of historical evidence. And then I just want to conclude with some examples that after the Seljuk period, giving an indication how influential the work that they had really, I won't say pioneered, but they had furthered to such an extent, went on to influence other cultures. This is after the Mongols had taken Iran. They were quick to embrace the geometric aesthetic, and this is an example. This is an Ottoman piece that is a very complex, lovely example. This is some Mamluk examples. Karakoyunlu, if I'm saying it correctly, this is from the mosque and the Great Mosque in Van, Eastern Turkey. Beautiful pattern. And of course, in Spain and in Morocco, the work is superlative. This is back in Iran, Muzaffarad. Timurid, beautiful pattern with 9 and 12 pointed stars and with 16s and 6s. 18s and 6s. Sebanid, this is a very nice arch spandrel, and Mughal. And just last, I just want to show that even non-Muslim cultures have been strongly influenced by Islamic geometric art, and that sort of like the earliest slides I showed you of the pre-Islamic examples that would have influenced. These are examples of non-Muslim art that are really quite beautiful and of outstanding quality. The one on the left is Armenian. It's a Kakachkar, if somebody could correct my pronunciation, but it's like a gravestone, but it's more of a commemorative marker. And this particular pattern is by a Christian monk called Momak, and it's a remarkable pattern with 10 and 11 pointed stars. It's actually a masterpiece of geometric pattern making, and it's as highly skilled and as sophisticated as the work that his Seljuk contemporaries were doing, and he has to have studied with a master pattern maker to have had the skill to do what he did. The example to the right of that is a 14-fold pattern, again a very sophisticated pattern that's from a church in Egypt. It's quite possible that it was actually made by Muslim craftsmen. It's not signed, so it's not known, but it was certainly ordered and used by Christian patrons. And the one in the middle is from a synagogue in Spain, in Cordoba. It's actually the same pattern as you're seeing here. It's quite a well-known pattern. And the one on the right I have a particular liking for, because first of all, I love patterns with 9 and 12 pointed stars that repeat on the isometric grid, but this is just extraordinary because it actually comes from Peru in the New World, and yet it's still 16th century. It's a pretty old pattern. So this aesthetic has a broad appeal to many people throughout the world. Well, thank you very much.